Richard Harlan thought the easiest way to prove he belonged among powerful people was to embarrass a woman who looked powerless, but he had no idea that the faded linen satchel on her shoulder carried papers worth more than every polished briefcase in Bristol Atlantic Bank. That Tuesday morning, the lobby gleamed like a place built to separate the important from the invisible. Sunlight poured through 20-foot windows and spilled across marble floors, so clean they reflected the brass lamps, the walnut counters, and the quiet parade of expensive shoes crossing from one private office to another. Men in tailored suits spoke softly into phones. Women with designer handbags sat beneath oil paintings of old bankers and older money. Every sound seemed controlled. The soft chime of the elevator, the careful tap of heels, the low murmur of people who believed wealth should never have to raise its voice. Then Clara Whitfield stepped through the revolving door. She was 39, white, with pale brown hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck, a cream cotton dress that looked more practical than fashionable, and flat shoes dusted from the 4-block walk from the train station. Over her shoulder hung a linen satchel, sun-faded at the edges, the kind of bag someone might bring to a farmer's market or a church book sale. It did not match the room. Clara knew that the moment she entered. She felt the glances touch the bag first, then her shoes, then her face, each one making a quick little judgment before sliding away. She did not lower her eyes. Inside the satchel, wrapped in a blue legal folder and tied with a plain white string, were the final documents for the Canal Acquisition Trust, a transaction that had been whispered about in boardrooms for months. The canal cut 38 miles through 3 counties, carrying grain, lumber, tools, and small-town livelihoods from the river docks to the industrial rail yards. If the wrong buyer took control, tolls would rise, docks would close, and families who had lived by that water for generations would be priced out of their own future. Clara had not come to Bristol Atlantic for attention. She had come because the escrow authorization had to be certified before noon, and because anonymity for one more morning still mattered. At the customer service desk, a young associate named Marcus Bell looked up and offered the kind of smile that had not yet been trained out of him.
"Good morning, ma'am.
How can I help you today?" Clara touched the strap of her satchel. "I'm here regarding a private acquisition escrow. The name on the file is Canal." Marcus blinked once, surprised by the phrase, then reached for his keyboard. Before his fingers touched the keys, a sharper voice cut through the air. "I'll handle this, Marcus." Richard Harlan approached from the private banking corridor, silver tie-centered, cuff links flashing, expression already decided. His eyes moved over Clara slowly, pausing on the linen bag, with open amusement. "Private acquisition," he repeated, as if the words had wandered into the wrong mouth. Clara stood still.
"Yes."
"I was told the documents could be reviewed here." Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Ma'am, this department works with institutional clients, not walk-in inquiries." Marcus shifted uneasily behind the desk. Clara nodded once. "I understand. That is why I brought the authorization papers." Richard gave a quiet laugh, just loud enough for 2 customers nearby to turn their heads. "With that satchel?" The room did not stop moving. Not yet, but something in the air tightened. Clara's hand rested gently on the faded linen, steady as a stone beneath running water. Richard held his smile a moment longer, enjoying the small audience forming around the desk. To him, the pause was power. He had spent 15 years inside rooms where people measured worth by watches, shoes, surnames, and the confidence to make others wait. That morning, he needed a victory more than anyone in the lobby understood. The promotion to regional director had slipped away from him the previous Friday, handed to a woman from the Charleston branch whom he privately believed had less polish, fewer connections, and no understanding of old money. Since then, every client who crossed his path had become a chance to prove his instincts were still sharp. Clara, with her cotton dress and worn satchel, looked like the easiest decision of the day. Marcus remained behind the desk, his hand hovering near the keyboard. "Mr. Harlan," he said carefully, "the Canal file is flagged for private review." Richard did not look at him. "I am aware of how private review works, Marcus." His voice was low, but the warning in it was unmistakable. Clara watched the young associate lower his hand. She had seen that kind of silence before, the silence of someone decent trapped under someone ambitious. It made her chest tighten more than Richard's insult had. "I have an appointment reference," Clara said. "The legal office sent it this morning." Richard extended his hand, not to welcome her, but to take control of the moment. "Then let us see what you brought." Clara slid the linen satchel from her shoulder and placed it gently on the polished stone counter. The bag made no sound. It looked almost painfully plain against the black marble, its stitching repaired near one corner with thread a shade lighter than the cloth. Richard's eyes dropped to the repair, and the corner of his mouth lifted. "I have to say," he murmured, "most people handling infrastructure acquisitions use a secure courier, not something that looks handmade at summer camp." A man seated nearby gave a short laugh, then pretended to cough when Clara turned slightly in his direction. Marcus looked embarrassed. Clara did not. She untied the small brass button on the satchel and reached inside, but Richard raised a hand before she could remove anything. "Not here," he said. "We cannot have random documents spread across a public counter. That would imply they are legitimate." The words landed with just enough volume to travel. A woman in a navy pantsuit stopped reviewing her phone. A security guard near the entrance glanced over. Clara felt the lobby narrowing around her, not physically but socially, the way public spaces can become small when everyone decides you do not belong. Still, her voice remained calm. "These documents are time-sensitive. They must be certified before noon Eastern Time." Richard checked his watch with theatrical patience. It was 10:37. "Time-sensitive," he repeated. "Of course. Everyone's emergency feels important to them." Clara inhaled slowly. "Mr. Harlan, if you check the reference number, you will see that Bristol Atlantic is escrow trustee on this transaction. The funds were pre-cleared last week." At the phrase pre-cleared, Richard's expression hardened. He heard confidence where he expected apology, and it irritated him. Confidence from clients in tailored suits reassured him. Confidence from a quiet woman with a repaired bag felt, to him, like disrespect. "Ma'am," he said, leaning slightly closer across the counter, "I need you to understand something. This bank manages serious capital for serious people. We are not a place where someone can walk in, say a few impressive words, and expect access to restricted financial channels." Clara's fingers rested on the satchel flap. "I am not asking for access. I am presenting authority." The lobby went still enough for the elevator chime to sound too loud. Richard let the silence stretch because he mistook it for control. He straightened his silver tie, glanced once at the watching customers, and gave Clara the polished expression of a man preparing to teach a lesson he believed everyone should hear. "Presenting authority," he said slowly. "That is an interesting phrase. In my experience, people with real authority do not announce it at a public counter while carrying documents in a cloth bag." A faint ripple moved through the lobby, not quite laughter, not quite approval, but enough to make Marcus look down at the desk. Clara noticed the young associate's discomfort, and for a moment her eyes softened. She knew humiliation often depended on witnesses. Richard knew it too. That was why he had chosen the open counter instead of a private office. That was why his voice carried just far enough to invite judgment without sounding openly cruel. Clara kept one hand on the satchel and the other at her side. "The authorization packet includes federal clearance, trustee instructions, and the escrow release conditions," she said. "If the file is delayed, the purchase window closes at noon." Richard gave another small laugh. "Ma'am, people do not buy public infrastructure the way they buy a used pickup truck."
The
man with the expensive watch near the waiting area smiled into his coffee. The woman in the navy pantsuit looked away, but not before Clara saw the flicker of pity on her face. Pity was almost worse than laughter. It suggested the room had already decided she was losing. Clara turned back to Richard. Canal is not public infrastructure in the strict legal sense. It has been privately operated under a state charter since 1938. The pending transfer requires bank certification because Bristol Atlantic holds the environmental bond and the workers' pension reserve. Marcus looked up quickly. That was not the kind of detail a confused walk-in would know. Richard heard it too, but pride blocked the warning before it reached him. He leaned back, folding his arms. "You have done some reading. That does not make you a qualified party." Clara's gaze stayed steady.
No.
The documents do. Richard's smile disappeared for half a second. Then he reached toward the satchel again, changed his mind, and turned to the security guard near the brass entrance doors. Thomas, would you please stand by while we sort this out? The guard, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a careful manner, stepped closer, but did not touch anyone. Clara felt the shift immediately. The bank had not raised its voice. It did not need to. The suggestion alone was enough to mark her as a problem. A heat rose behind her cheeks, quiet but sharp. Not shame, not exactly. It was the old frustration of being underestimated in beautiful rooms by people who confused appearance with proof. Richard lowered his voice, though every person nearby could still hear him. I am going to be direct with you. If you have legitimate paperwork, you may schedule a review through proper channels. If you do not, then continuing this conversation becomes disruptive. Clara looked past him, through the tall windows where sunlight flashed on the river beyond the street. Somewhere downstream, tugboats were moving through the canal locks, and workers were beginning another ordinary day without knowing that their future might be decided in this cold marble lobby. She turned back to Richard.
The
proper channel is standing in front of you. He blinked. Clara untied the white string around the blue folder inside her bag, but before she could pull it free, he placed his palm flat on the counter. Enough. His voice cracked through the lobby, like a dropped glass. The conversation stopped. Even the elevator doors opened without anyone stepping out. Richard pointed at the faded linen satchel with visible contempt. That bag does not carry a Canal purchase. At most, it carries wishful thinking and a misunderstanding of how serious finance works. Clara's fingers paused on the folder. For the first time, the hurt showed in her face, small and human, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Then she lifted her eyes to his. No, Mr. Harlan, she said quietly. It carries the only thing your bank was supposed to respect before it respected money. Proof. For one breath, no one moved. The word proof seemed to settle over the marble lobby with a weight Richard had not expected. Clara drew the blue folder from the linen satchel and placed it on the counter, not dramatically, not angrily, but with the careful calm of someone who understood that truth did not need a raised voice. The white string loosened beneath her fingers. Inside were stamped pages, embossed seals, trustee instructions, and a cream envelope bearing the crest of Whitfield Infrastructure Trust. Marcus saw the crest first. His eyes widened, then moved quickly to the reference number printed at the top of the escrow authorization. He whispered, almost without meaning to, Mr. Harlan, this is the file. Richard turned sharply. Do not be ridiculous. But his confidence had shifted. It was still there, polished and upright, but now it stood on thinner ground. Clara separated the first page from the stack and turned it toward him. The escrow certification request was dated that morning. The transaction amount was written clearly in black ink. $382 million. Richard stared at the number, and for the first time since Clara had entered the bank, his mouth did not know what shape to take. Around him, the customers who had been quietly entertained by her humiliation began to understand they had been watching the wrong person. The man with the expensive watch stopped smiling. The woman in the navy pantsuit lowered her phone. Even Thomas, the security guard, stepped half a pace back, as if distance could apologize for being summoned. Marcus leaned closer, reading the header. Merrow Canal Acquisition Trust, Escrow Release Authorization, Bristol Atlantic Bank, Trustee Certification required before 12 o'clock Eastern Time. Clara did not look at Richard while Marcus read. Her gaze rested on the documents instead, on the months of work, the late-night calls, the legal reviews, the community meetings held in church basements and dock offices, the faces of families who had asked whether anything could still be done. She remembered an old boat mechanic named Henry telling her that his grandfather had helped repair the first lock gate after the flood of 1955. She remembered a waitress near the West Dock saying the canal was not just water, it was how the town breathed. Those people were not in the bank lobby. They had no designer bags, no private bankers, no polished voices. But their lives were folded into those papers. Richard reached for the page, then stopped when Clara placed one finger lightly on the corner. Please verify before touching the originals, she said. Her politeness made the instructions sting more. He swallowed, then glanced toward Marcus. Pull up the internal file. Began descending the staircase, each step quiet, precise, and final. Eleanor Price descended the staircase without hurry, and somehow that made the entire lobby feel smaller. She was 58, white, dressed in a charcoal blazer with a pearl pin at her collar, the kind of woman whose authority did not need volume because people had learned to make room for it. Conversations faded as she reached the marble floor. Richard saw her first, and the panic he tried to hide passed across his face like a shadow. Madam Chair, he said quickly, this is just a verification matter. I was handling it. Eleanor did not answer him immediately. Her eyes moved to Clara, then to the blue folder, then to the faded linen satchel resting on the counter beside documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The contrast was so sharp it seemed almost unreal. The repaired cloth bag beside embossed legal seals, quiet simplicity beside institutional power. Miss Whitfield, Eleanor said at last, her voice controlled and respectful. Bristol Atlantic has been expecting your representative. Clara met her gaze. I am the representative. I tried to explain that. Eleanor absorbed the words without blinking, but everyone close enough to hear understood what they meant. Clara had not been confused. She had not wandered into the wrong department. She had not exaggerated her importance. She had done everything properly, and the bank had chosen appearance over procedure. Richard cleared his throat. The appointment did not list a physical description, and given the sensitivity of the transaction, I thought it prudent to proceed with caution. Clara turned to him then, not with anger, but with a steadiness that was somehow harder to face. Caution checks a file, Mr. Harlan. It does not mock a client in public. Marcus lowered his eyes, but Eleanor did not. She looked directly at Richard. Did you check the file before calling security? Richard's lips parted. The lobby waited. It was a simple question, and that made it dangerous. He adjusted one cuff link, buying a second that did not save him. I was in the process of determining credibility. Eleanor's expression cooled. Credibility was in the system at 8:17 this morning. It was in the reference number Miss Whitfield gave you. It was in the transaction name. It was in the trustee alert sent to every senior officer in this building. Richard had no answer. The silence around him deepened. A few minutes earlier, he had made Clara stand in that silence alone. Now it had turned, cleanly and completely, toward him. Eleanor stepped closer to the counter and looked at Marcus. Mr. Bell, please confirm the escrow lock deadline. Marcus straightened immediately. Noon Eastern Time, Madam Chair. Current time is 10:46. All certification steps can still be completed if we move the file to executive review now.
Good, Eleanor said.
Then you will assist Miss Whitfield personally. Marcus looked stunned.
Me?
Clara's face softened for the first time. He was the only person who offered to help before deciding whether I belonged here. The words did not strike loudly, but they landed everywhere. Thomas, the security guard, looked down at his polished shoes. The man with the watch set his coffee aside. The woman in the navy pantsuit pressed her lips together as if she wished she had spoken sooner. Eleanor turned back to Richard. You will step away from this transaction immediately. Richard's composure cracked. Madam Chair, with respect, I have handled accounts larger than this. No, Eleanor said. You have handled numbers. Today you failed to handle a person. The lobby went silent again, but this time it was not the silence of judgment against Clara. It was the silence that comes when everyone realizes the lesson has found its rightful owner. Eleanor guided Clara and Marcus through the glass doors leading to the executive review suite, but the silence from the lobby followed them like a shadow. Behind them, Richard remained beside the counter, no longer commanding the room, no longer framed by polished stone and private banking signs as if they belonged to him. For the first time that morning, he looked like an employee waiting to be judged by the standards he had forgotten to practice. Clara carried the linen satchel herself. Eleanor offered to have an assistant take it, but Clara gave a small, polite shake of her head. These papers have traveled with me since 5 this morning, she said. I would rather keep them close until the certification is complete. Eleanor understood. Some documents were more than documents. Some carried promises. Inside the executive room, the mood changed from spectacle to urgency. The walls were lined with framed maps of old shipping routes, and beyond the broad windows, the river flashed silver under late morning sun. Marcus opened the secure terminal with hands that moved quickly, but carefully. Clara laid the documents out in precise order. Trustee instructions first, then the environmental bond transfer, then the pension reserve protection agreement, then the sealed authorization from Whitfield Infrastructure Trust. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, reading each page with increasing seriousness. I knew this acquisition was significant, she said, but I was not aware of the community protection clauses. Clara slid another document forward. Most buyers wanted the canal for toll leverage. We wanted it because everyone else was looking at the water and seeing profit. The towns along its sea work, history, and survival. Marcus paused over the keyboard. The new operating charter freezes commercial tolls for 7 years? Clara nodded. It also preserves every existing dock lease under 1,000 square feet, funds lock repairs without passing costs to small carriers, and protects the pension reserve for canal workers already in retirement. Eleanor looked up slowly. That will cut the projected return almost in half. Clara's expression did not change. Only if return is measured in money alone. The room became very quiet. Not the cruel silence of the lobby, but a different kind, the kind that arrives when people realize they are standing near something larger than a transaction. Marcus continued entering the verification codes. At 11:02, the first clearance turned green. At 11:07, the environmental bond matched. At 11:14, the trustee authorization accepted Clara's signature. Each confirmation appeared on the screen with a soft sound, and each one seemed to push the morning farther away from Richard's judgment and closer to the lives waiting beyond the bank's marble walls. Eleanor reviewed the final seal. Miss Whitfield, may I ask why you came alone? With a transaction this size, most people would arrive with attorneys, advisors, and a public relations team. Clara looked down at the faded satchel, thumb brushing the repaired corner. Because my father used to carry canal maps in this bag when he worked as a surveyor. He taught me that important places are usually protected by ordinary people long before powerful people notice them. Marcus stopped typing for a moment. Eleanor's face softened, but only slightly. She had spent decades in banking, and she had seen fortunes built, lost, hidden, and displayed. But she had rarely seen wealth carried like responsibility instead of decoration. At 11:23, Marcus looked up from the terminal. The file is ready for final trustee certification. Eleanor turned the screen toward Clara. Then let us finish what should have been respected from the beginning. Clara studied the screen for a moment before placing her signature on the digital pad. Her hand did not tremble. The final certification required 3 confirmations, one from the authorized representative, one from the trustee officer, and one from the chair of institutional review. Marcus prepared each field with care, reading every line aloud so there could be no misunderstanding, no shortcut, no excuse left behind. Authorized representative, Clara and Whitfield, acting on behalf of Whitfield Infrastructure Trust. Trustee institution, Bristol Atlantic Bank. Asset transfer, Merrow Canal operating rights, associated bond protections, dock lease preservation, and worker pension reserve. Clara listened to the words as if they were names of people rather than clauses on a screen. Eleanor entered her approval code, then paused before the final submission. Through the glass wall, the lobby was visible below, still bright, still elegant, but changed. Richard sat alone near a side office with a human resources director beside him, his shoulders lowered, his eyes fixed on nothing. The customers who had watched Clara be questioned now pretended not to watch at all. That, too, was part of the lesson. Some people only look away after the truth asks what they were willing to tolerate. Eleanor turned back to Clara. Once I press this, the escrow releases immediately. The canal transfer becomes binding. Clara nodded. Then the workers will still have their docks tomorrow. Eleanor pressed submit. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the screen refreshed, and a green confirmation banner appeared across the top. Trustee certification complete. Escrow released. Transfer accepted. Marcus exhaled like he had been holding his breath for an hour. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, not from relief alone, but from the quiet knowledge that the bank had nearly failed at the exact moment it was supposed to serve. Clara placed the signed confirmation into the blue folder, tied the white string around it, and slid it back into the linen satchel. The bag looked the same as before, soft, faded, repaired at the corner. Yet now everyone in that room understood what it had carried. Not just money, not just papers. A choice about what kind of future a place deserved. Eleanor opened the executive room door herself. When Clara stepped back into the lobby with Marcus beside her, the atmosphere changed again. No one laughed. No one whispered. A few employees stood straighter. The man with the expensive watch lowered his gaze as Clara passed. The woman in the navy pantsuit rose from her chair and said softly, "Miss Whitfield, I should have spoken up." Clara stopped, not to shame her, but to look at her fully. "It is never too late to become the kind of person who does," she said. The woman nodded, her face flushed. Near the side office, Richard stood when he saw Clara approaching. His apology came quickly, polished by fear. "Miss Whitfield, I sincerely regret the misunderstanding." Clara held the strap of her satchel with one hand. "It was not a misunderstanding, Mr. Harlan. You understood exactly what you wanted to see." The lobby went silent, and this time, no one tried to rescue him from it. Richard looked at Clara as if he expected anger, because anger would have given him something familiar to manage. He could have apologized to anger, negotiated with anger, blamed the pressure of the morning, the sensitivity of the account, the need to protect the bank. But Clara offered him no anger to hide behind. She offered only the truth, spoken quietly in front of the same people who had heard him mock her. That made it worse. Eleanor stepped beside Clara, her expression measured. "Mr. Harlan, you will leave the lobby and meet with internal review immediately. Until that review is complete, your access to private client files is suspended." Richard swallowed hard. "Madam Chair, I understand that mistakes were made." Eleanor did not blink. "Mistakes are entered incorrectly on forms. What happened here was a choice repeated several times after you were given facts." The words moved through the lobby with almost physical force. Marcus stood a few feet behind Clara, still holding the final confirmation folder. He looked different now, not because his suit had changed or his title had changed, but because someone powerful had finally noticed the quiet decency he had practiced when no one was rewarding it. Clara turned toward him. "Mr. Bell, would you please send a certified copy of the completion notice to the Marrow Canal Workers Association and to the county clerk before noon?" Marcus nodded immediately. "Yes, Miss Whitfield. I will do it now." His voice was steady, but his eyes shone with the kind of pride that does not need applause. Richard watched Marcus move behind the desk, and something like realization crossed his face. The junior associate he had interrupted, the one he had treated as invisible, was now handling the transaction that could have defined Richard's career. That was the justice of it. Not loud, not theatrical, simply exact. Clara adjusted the strap of her satchel on her shoulder. Thomas, the security guard, stepped forward carefully, his cap in both hands. "Miss Whitfield, I am sorry I stood there and made you feel unwelcome." Clara looked at him, and her expression softened. "You were asked to stand near me. The harder question is what you will do the next time someone is made to feel small." Thomas nodded, humbled but grateful for the chance to answer with his future instead of his excuses. Across the lobby, the woman in the navy pantsuit wiped at one eye. The man with the expensive watch stared at the marble floor, as if seeing his reflection there had become uncomfortable. Eleanor turned to the staff gathered near the counters. "Let this be understood clearly. At Bristol Atlantic, dignity is not a premium service. It is the first service." No one spoke. There was no need. Outside the tall windows, traffic moved along the river road, and far beyond the buildings, the canal waited under the late morning sun, carrying barges, families, history, and now a second chance. Clara walked toward the revolving doors with the same quiet steps she had taken when she arrived. The linen satchel rested against her hip, faded and repaired, still looking like something ordinary. But every eye in the room followed it now, not because it looked expensive, but because it had exposed the poverty of judging people by what they carry instead of what they stand for. Outside Bristol Atlantic, the city sounded different to Clara than it had that morning. Cars passed along the curb, a delivery truck rumbled over a steel plate in the road, and somewhere beyond the financial district, a boat horn carried faintly from the river. She paused on the sidewalk, letting the late morning air touch her face. The linen satchel hung from her shoulder, lighter now that the certification was complete, though nothing about its appearance had changed. It was still faded at the edges. It still held the careful repair her father had stitched by hand years before, after a rainstorm tore the corner while he was surveying the East Lock. Clara ran her thumb over that patch and thought of him standing beside the canal with rolled maps under one arm, telling her that places survive when ordinary people refuse to let powerful people treat them as numbers. Behind the glass doors, Eleanor watched from the lobby as Marcus sent the final notices. At 11:42, the Marrow Canal Workers Association received confirmation that the transfer had been accepted. At 11:46, the county clerk stamped the first public record. At 11:51, a dock supervisor named Henry Wallace stood in a small office 30 miles away, reading the message twice before removing his glasses and covering his mouth with one weathered hand. By noon, the news had traveled faster than any official statement. At the West Dock, a mechanic told a tugboat captain. At a diner near Lock 4, a waitress read the message aloud to 3 men in work jackets. At the county office, a clerk whispered that the toll freeze was real, the dock leases were protected, and the pension reserve had not been sacrificed. No one in those places had seen the marble lobby. No one had heard Richard Harlan laugh at a cloth bag, but they would feel the result of the papers inside it. That was the kind of power Clara respected most, the kind that reached people who would never know the whole story, but would wake the next morning with one less fear pressing against their lives. Inside the bank, Richard sat before internal review, his silver tie loosened, his voice smaller than it had been an hour before. Eleanor did not raise her voice.
She did not need to.
The record was clear, the witnesses were clear, and the lesson was clearer than both. He had not lost authority because Clara exposed him. He had lost it the moment he decided dignity had a dress code. By the end of the day, Marcus Bell received a temporary assignment to the Executive Client Integrity Team, not because Clara demanded it, but because Eleanor understood that institutions are changed by the people they choose to elevate. Clara returned to the canal just before sunset. The water shone copper beneath the sky, and a slow barge moved through the lock as gulls circled above the warehouses. She stood on the wooden dock, cream dress moving gently in the river breeze, the linen satchel at her side. It looked ordinary against the fading light, almost too simple for what it had carried. But Clara smiled, because ordinary things had always done the hardest work. And that day, a bank full of polished leather and polished manners learned what the canal workers had known for generations. Worth is not proven by how loudly wealth announces itself, but by how quietly it protects what matters.